Brexit means Brexit, doesn't it? Or what about taking back control? Well, at least you have to try, don't you? But UK media, including the BBC and the Financial Times, report that post-Brexit food import restrictions and checks are set to be put off a fifth time. But what will they mean for travellers from France if and when they do come in, for example? Unlike the EU, which imposed full third country formalities on UK imports immediately on January 1st, 2021, London decided on a phased approach to border checks. It has re-established customs checks, but so far has repeatedly put off food import restrictions, including animal and health checks and certificates. And most recently, they were meant to start in October this year. But the UK government has delayed the introduction of post-Brexit food import restrictions and checks for the fifth time now. The decision has been made amid concerns that the checks would push up prices and fuel inflation. The government had originally planned to introduce the checks in October 2021, but this was delayed to January 22. The checks were then delayed again to July 22, October 22, and January 23. And the latest delay means that the checks are now not to be expected to be introduced until at least October 23. But you never know. They will know. October is delayed again. And there are a number of reasons why the government has delayed the introduction of the checks. One reason is that the government is concerned about the impact that the checks would have on businesses and consumers. Oh, Brexit does have an impact? The checks are expected to add to the cost of food, which could lead to higher prices for consumers. And the checks could also disrupt supply chains, which would lead to shortages of some foods. Another reason for the delay is that the government is still working out the details of how the checks will be implemented. Well, 8 years after the vote. The government has said that it wants to make sure that the checks are effective in protecting public health and food safety, but it also wants to make sure that the checks do not have a disproportionate impact on businesses and consumers. The decision to delay the introduction of the checks has been met with mixed reactions, though. Some businesses have welcomed the delay, saying that it will give them more time to prepare for the checks. However, other businesses have criticized the delay, saying that it is a sign of government incompetence. It really is unclear when the checks will finally be introduced. The government has said that it will continue to monitor the situation and make a decision about the timing of the checks in due course. Well, introducing post-Brexit food import restriction and checks would mean that all food imported into the UK from the European Union would be subject to physical checks and paperwork requirements, of course. And this would include checks on the safety of the food, as well as checks on the documentation accompanying the food. The checks would be carried out by border force officials at ports and other entry points in the UK. The checks would be designed to ensure that the food imported into the UK meets the same high standards of safety and quality as food produced in the UK. The introduction of the checks would have a number of implications for businesses and consumers. That is true, because Brexit does do that. Businesses would then need to comply with the new requirements, which could add to their costs. And consumers could also see higher prices for some foods, as the checks would add the cost of importing food. However, the checks could also have some positive benefits. For example, they could help to protect public health by ensuring that only safe food is imported into the UK. No one is checking if that food is even on EU standards at the moment. And it also could help that the UK industry is a bit more competitive by leveling the playing field with the EU food producers. But overall, the introduction of post-Brexit food import restrictions and checks would have indeed an impact on businesses and consumers. And there would be costs associated with the checks, but the level playing field might be something that they want, because now they have disadvantages, because the other way around, there are checks for a long time. And businesses that import food from the EU would need to comply with the new requirements, and that would then add to the cost. And this would include the cost of hiring new staff, but also the cost of updating the IT systems and the cost of transporting food through the UK border, which would take more time. And the check would also add to the cost of food, which leads to higher prices for the consumers. And it's clear when the food is more expensive to be brought into the country, the end price will be higher because they pass on the costs to the consumers. And I already talked about the supply chains, that there might be some shortages of foods because it takes time, because the checks could slow down the flow of the food through the UK border, and businesses may not be able to get the food they need in time there. And that is something that people should think about. And of course, the food has to be checked if it's coming from a third place, because food always can be contaminated with something. And if there are no checks and no certificates needed, you don't know what's coming in there. And the checks would make all food imported into the UK apply with the standards there. But the standards in the EU are quite high, so that's not the issue. But at the moment, I could send in whatever I want, obviously, because they are not checking. And that years after Brexit. And I made some videos on preparations. How did which country and so on prepare for Brexit? And the EU did prepare for Brexit. I haven't made that video yet because I haven't done all the 27 yet, but I did the UK. And of course, they started the checks on British food the day Brexit happened and they were out of the transition period. Of course, because that's what you do when you take control of your borders. So much about taking control of borders. But as I said in the very beginning of the video, Brexit means Brexit. And then you should do what is necessary. But the incompetence part from the industry is something to think about, I guess. And if you want to see something else about Brexit or UK politics, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.